The salt-heavy breeze of the Atlantic Ocean sweeps across the rugged cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, carrying with it the ghosts of a vanished world, a world of white marble, silk gowns, and a level of opulence that the American soil had never seen before and would likely never see again. At the turn of the 20th century, during the peak of the Gilded Age, Newport was not merely a summer retreat. It was a battlefield of social prestige, an arena where the nation's wealthiest families fought for dominance not with weapons, but with the sheer scale of their estates and the audacity of their entertainment. Standing at the epicenter of this gilded whirlwind was Rosecliff, a vision in white terracotta modeled after the Grand Trianon of Versailles, commissioned by Theresa Fair Ulrichs, a woman whose ambition was as vast as the silver mines that funded her existence. To understand Rosecliff is to understand the frantic pulse of an era defined by extreme wealth and the desperate need for validation, a time when the nouveau riches sought to build monuments that could rival the palaces of European royalty. As we gaze upon its grand facade today, the silent halls echo with the laughter of 1,000 guests and the clinking of crystal, masking a reality of rigid social codes and the scandalous excesses that would eventually define the downfall of an empire of elegance. Theresa Fair Ulrichs, known to her inner circle as Tessie, was the daughter of James Graham Fair, one of the Silver Kings, who had struck the Comstock lode in Nevada. Her upbringing was a far cry from the refined parlors of the East Coast. She was raised in the raw, dusty reality of the American West, where fortunes were made overnight in the dark depths of the earth. However, when she arrived in Newport with her husband, Herman Ulrichs, she brought with her a fierce determination to conquer the high society led by the formidable Caroline Astor. Tessie recognized that in Newport, power was measured by the square foot and the brilliance of one's chandelier. In 1891, the couple purchased the original Rosecliff estate from the estate of George Bancroft, a renowned historian and diplomat. But the modest wooden villa that stood there was insufficient for Tessie's grand vision. She sought out Stanford White, the most celebrated architect of the age and a partner at the legendary firm McKim, Mead & White, tasking him with creating a house that would serve as the ultimate stage for the most elaborate parties Newport had ever witnessed. Between 1898 and 1902, white terracotta tiles were painstakingly laid, and a grand heart-shaped staircase, the largest in Newport, was constructed to ensure that every entrance Tessie made would be nothing short of theatrical. The architecture of Rosecliff was a deliberate provocation, a statement of arrival that challenged the established order. Stanford White designed the mansion to be a party house in the truest sense, prioritizing the flow of guests and the acoustics of the ballroom over the comforts of domestic life. The central ballroom, spanning 80 feet by 40 feet, was the largest on the island, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that blurred the line between the manicured gardens and the gilded interior. It was within these walls that the social hierarchy of the Gilded Age was forged and broken. The cost of the house reached a staggering $2.5 million at the time, an astronomical sum that reflected the Ulrichs' desire to cement their status. Yet, as the final touches of gold leaf were applied to the ceilings, the air in Newport was thick with more than just the scent of the sea. It was charged with a competitive fever. The Vanderbilts, the Belmonts, and the Astors were all watching, waiting to see if the daughter of a Nevada miner could truly orchestrate a spectacle that would live up to the architectural masterpiece Stanford White had provided. As the doors of Rosecliff officially swung open in the summer of 1902, the American aristocracy found themselves stepping into a realm of curated perfection that bordered on the surreal. Tessie Ulrichs was not merely a hostess, she was a meticulous, almost obsessive conductor of social performance. She was known to inspect the mansion with a white glove, demanding that the marble floors be polished until they reflected the flicker of candlelight like a mirror, and she famously patrolled the kitchens to ensure that the silver was burnished to a blinding sheen. The debut of the mansion marked a shift in Newport's social fabric, where the parties began to transcend simple gatherings and evolved into immersive, multi-sensory experiences designed to stun the senses and bankrupt the imagination. Tessie's social maneuvers were calculated to ensure that Rosecliff was the most talked-about destination on the East Coast, and she achieved this through a series of themed entertainments that pushed the boundaries of Victorian propriety and financial sanity. One of the most legendary and scandalous events to take place within the white terracotta walls was the Bal Blanc, or the White Ball. To celebrate the anniversary of her housewarming, Tessie decreed that every guest must dress entirely in white, creating a ghostly, ethereal sea of silk and lace that flowed through the grand ballroom. But the visual spectacle did not stop at the guest list. Outside, in the harbor that bordered the estate, Tessie had commissioned a fleet of white-painted ships to sit anchored in the water, their sails bleached and their hulls illuminated by hundreds of electric lights, a burgeoning technology that was still a novelty to many. The sheer logistical nightmare and the staggering cost of painting entire vessels just for a single night's aesthetic reflected the conspicuous consumption that sociologist Thorstein Veblen famously analyzed during this period. For Tessie, the goal was not comfort or even genuine hospitality. It was the assertion of a power so absolute that she could bend the very landscape to her whim for a few fleeting hours of revelry. However, beneath the veneer of white silk and sparkling champagne, the scandals of Rosecliff were beginning to simmer. The Gilded Age was a time of rigid moral posturing, yet the privacy of Newport's cottages often shielded behaviors that would have been shunned in the public eye. Tessie herself was a polarizing figure, sharp-tongued, fiercely competitive, and often described as having a mechanical approach to friendship. The parties at Rosecliff were often the backdrop for high-stakes gossip and the quiet destruction of reputations. It was rumored that at one of her famous dinners, a guest who had fallen out of favor was seated at a table where the centerpiece was so large and dense they were completely obscured from the rest of the party, a silent, velvet-draped execution of their social standing. The tension between the old money families, who valued a certain level of understated, if still massive, wealth, and the new money titans like the Ulrichs, who favored ostentation, reached a breaking point within Rosecliff's walls. Every invitation sent was a weapon, and every snub was a declaration of war in a society where being excluded from a Rosecliff ball was equivalent to social death. The excess reached its zenith with the infamous Mother Goose ball and other whimsical, yet terrifyingly expensive, masquerades. Tessie once hosted a party where the guest of honor was rumored to be a prince, only for the guests to discover, after hours of bowing and scraping, that the prince was actually a trained monkey dressed in a tuxedo. While some found this a hilarious subversion of Newport's stuffy atmosphere, others saw it as a biting insult to the very aristocracy Tessie sought to lead. This era of Rosecliff was defined by this delicate balance between the sublime and the ridiculous, where the beauty of Stanford White's architecture provided a dignified mask for the increasingly erratic and desperate displays of wealth. The scandal wasn't just in the behavior of the guests, but in the blatant disregard for the mounting social inequalities of the era, as thousands of dollars were spent on floral arrangements that would wilt by dawn, while the miners in her father's Comstock lode labored in the dark for pennies. As the first decade of the 20th century progressed, the atmosphere within Rosecliff began to shift from one of celebratory triumph to a more frenetic, almost desperate display of dominance. Tessie Ulrichs, now firmly established as one of the triumvirate of Newport hostesses alongside Alva Belmont and Mamie Fish, pushed the boundaries of the Scandalous party to new heights. It was during this period that the parties at Rosecliff became legendary not just for their beauty, but for their eccentricity. One of the most talked about events was the Silver Dinner, where the dining table was transformed into a miniature landscape featuring a flowing river of real mercury, a nod to the Fair family's mining roots, winding between silver-plated mountains and miniature forests. The sheer toxicity and danger of the mercury were overlooked in favor of the visual shock it provided. Such displays were a testament to the era's detachment from reality. While the rest of the country grappled with the labor movements of the progressive era, Rosecliff remained a bubble of gilded insulation where the only law was the whim of the hostess. However, the internal life of Rosecliff was far less harmonious than its symmetrical facade suggested. The marriage between Tessie and Herman Ulrichs was crumbling under the weight of their divergent lifestyles. Herman, a sportsman and a man who preferred the company of his club friends to the rigid theatricality of Tessie's ballroom, spent increasing amounts of time away from Newport. Tessie, in turn, retreated further into her role as the dictator of Newport, her behavior becoming increasingly erratic. She was known to suffer from bouts of extreme paranoia and obsessive-compulsive tendencies, often firing servants on the spot if a single piece of silver was misplaced or if a speck of dust was found in the cavernous laundry rooms. The party house was becoming a gilded cage. The scandal of their looming separation, a rarity in a circle that preferred quiet infidelities to public divorce, whispered through the hallways during every gala, adding a layer of tragic tension to the music of the orchestras. The year 1906 brought a chilling omen of the end of this era. The Great San Francisco earthquake struck, and since much of the Fair family fortune was tied up in West Coast real estate and banking, the Ulrichs family faced a sudden, terrifying instability. While they remained immensely wealthy by any standard, the psychological blow was profound. It was during this time that the scandals at Rosecliff took on a more somber tone. The parties continued, but they felt like performances of a ghost play. Tessie's obsession with cleanliness and order intensified to a point of mania. She would reportedly have the entire exterior of the mansion scrubbed with soap and water by a small army of workers. The grand heart-shaped staircase, once a symbol of romantic elegance, now saw a mistress who walked its steps with a growing sense of isolation, her husband gone and her social circle beginning to thin as the younger generation looked toward more modern, less formal ways of living. The most profound scandal of this middle period was perhaps the hidden decay of the Gilded Age dream itself. Behind the scenes at Rosecliff, the cost of maintaining such a lifestyle was becoming unsustainable even for the richest. The staff of Rosecliff, over 40 servants including footmen, ladies' maids, and gardeners, lived in a world of strict hierarchy and grueling labor that stood in stark contrast to the leisure of the floors above. Documents from the period reveal a growing resentment among the invisible workforce, as the demands of Tessie's perfectionism pushed them to the brink. The mansion was a machine of social production, and as the gears began to grind, the cracks in the terracotta started to appear. The parties were no longer just celebrations. They were defensive maneuvers against a changing world that was starting to question the morality of such concentrated wealth. The year 1913 marked a seismic shift in the American landscape with the introduction of the federal income tax, a legislative blow that began to drain the lifeblood of Newport's extravagant cottage culture. At Rosecliff, the transition was marked by a poignant mixture of defiance and decline. Tessie Ulrichs, ever the stubborn guardian of her own legend, refused to scale back. While other families began to shutter their massive estates or limit their staff, Tessie doubled down on the theatricality of her domain. However, the nature of the scandal had shifted. It was no longer about the shock of a Mercury River, but the scandal of a woman losing her grip on the very reality she had constructed. By the mid-1910s, Tessie's mental health had become the subject of whispered conversations across the manicured lawns of Bellevue Avenue. She began to live in a state of perpetual preparation for parties that existed only in her mind, wandering the vast, silent ballroom of Rosecliff in full evening dress, instructing phantom servants to adjust the lighting for guests who would never arrive. The tragedy of Rosecliff during this era was mirrored in the broader world. As the drums of World War I began to beat in Europe, the frivolous competition of the Gilded Age seemed increasingly grotesque. The younger generation of the Newport elite, including Tessie's own son, Herman Ulrichs Jr., found the rigid social codes of their parents to be suffocating and irrelevant. The parties at Rosecliff, once the hottest ticket in the country, were now seen as relics of a bygone, tone-deaf era. The scandal now lay in the obsolescence of the mansion itself. Stanford White's masterpiece, designed for flow and acoustics, felt echoing and cold without the warmth of 1,000 bodies. Tessie's isolation was compounded by the death of her estranged husband in 1906 and her sister Virginia in 1917. She became a hermit in a palace, a ghost haunting her own monument to vanity, yet she maintained the house with a ferocity that suggested that as long as the marble was clean, the era could not truly end. The most dramatic incident of this period occurred when Tessie's behavior became so erratic that family members had to intervene. It was reported that she would often wake in the middle of the night and demand the ballroom be fully lit and the orchestra, which was no longer on retainer, be ready to play. Her obsession with the perfect party had transcended social ambition and become a psychological refuge. The grand heart-shaped staircase, which had seen the most powerful men and women in America descend its steps, now witnessed the slow, solitary decline of the woman who had brought it to life. When Tessie finally passed away in 1926, the era of Rosecliff as a private home of the Silver Queens effectively died with her. The house was left to her son, but the financial burden of such an estate in the post-war world was becoming an insurmountable shadow. The 1920s brought a brief, flickering revival to the mansion as Herman Jr. attempted to modernize the estate's social life, but the jazz age, Newport was a different beast entirely. The parties were fueled by bootleg gin and a sense of frantic nihilism rather than the structured, imperial elegance of Tessie's day. The scandal was now one of neglect and the looming threat of the wrecking ball. Rosecliff stood as a white elephant, a beautiful, terrifyingly expensive reminder of a family that had spent its fortune on a dream of social immortality. As the Great Depression loomed on the horizon, the question was no longer who would be invited to the next ball at Rosecliff, but whether the mansion itself could survive the crushing weight of its own history. The silence that fell over Rosecliff following Tessie Ulrich's death was more than just the absence of music. It was the quietude of a museum waiting to be born. As the Great Depression tightened its grip on America, the flamboyant excesses of the Gilded Age were viewed with a mixture of resentment and nostalgia. The mansion passed through the hands of several owners, including Gertrude Niesen, a singer and actress of the 1940s, but the sheer cost of maintaining such a party house proved a burden that even the wealthy found daunting. The scandals of the past, the Mercury Rivers, the trained monkeys in tuxedos, the phantom balls, became the local lore of Newport, bedtime stories of a time when money was treated like water. Rosecliff faced the very real threat of being demolished or subdivided, a fate that befell many of its neighboring estates as the mid-century modern world had little use for 80-foot ballrooms and terracotta facades. The true salvation of Rosecliff came in 1971, when Mr. and Mrs. J. Edgar Monroe of New Orleans, the mansion's final private owners, donated the estate along with an endowment to the Preservation Society of Newport County. This act transformed the scandalous private stage into a public treasure, allowing the world to peer behind the velvet curtains. However, Rosecliff's relationship with the show was far from over. Its cinematic beauty and scandalous history made it the perfect surrogate for the lost world of F. Scott Fitzgerald. In 1974, the mansion served as a primary filming location for The Great Gatsby, starring Robert Redford and Mia Farrow. The irony was profound. A house built by a woman desperate to be the center of the American social stage finally achieved global immortality by playing the role of a fictional monument to the American dream's fragility. The scenes of lavish, desperate parties filmed in the Rosecliff Ballroom were not just Hollywood magic. They were a hauntingly accurate echo of the life Tessie Ulrichs had actually led. Today, as tourists walk through the heart-shaped staircase and gaze out at the Atlantic from the terrace, Rosecliff stands as a silent witness to the cyclical nature of wealth and power. It remains a place of contradictions, a monument to the immense labor of the working class who built and maintained it, and a testament to the fragile mental state of those who sat at the top of the social pyramid. The scandalous parties are now analyzed as sociological phenomena, markers of an era when America was defining its identity through the lens of extreme capitalism. The mansion is no longer a site of exclusive exclusion, but a place of education and reflection. The ultimate scandal of Rosecliff, perhaps, is how quickly the gilded world tarnished, leaving behind only the cold, beautiful marble and the stories of a woman who spent a silver fortune trying to buy a moment that would never end. The legacy of Rosecliff is a reminder that while empires fall and fortunes fade, the human desire for spectacle and the need to leave a physical mark on the world remain constant. Tessie Ulrich succeeded in her goal of social immortality, though not in the way she might have imagined. She is remembered not for her pedigree or her grace, but for the audacity of her ambition and the magnificent white palace that still stands defiantly against the salt spray of the Atlantic. Rosecliff remains the ultimate gilded relic, beautiful, hollow, and hauntingly evocative of an era that defined the American century through both its brilliance and its deep, shadowed excesses. Quote,